Okay, let's get into it here, boys. So we're going to be refining the tier list here. I've changed some of my opinions since the last time we did a tier list video about the decks in Pauper. So let's get right into it. First things first, we're going to need to have Coggates. We'll use Soul Sisters for Coggates this time. I think Coggate is simply the best deck. Deck is immensely powerful, has insane grind game, of course, has the cats, can put up reasonable clocks against any sort of strategy, and has the true name Nemesis, Guardian of the Guild Pact, and abuses it the best out of any deck in the format, with access to Basilisk Gate. So yeah, that deck is pretty hard to beat, and I think that the skilled pilots with that deck, are able to achieve probably the highest win rates in the format out of any deck. So next, second best deck, we'll use this to represent Dimir Terror. I think this is the second best deck. This deck is very strong. Can have insane nut draws where you put out like 3 5/5s on turn 3. It's just insanely powerful. It can give them lifelink. It has access to the best cheap interaction. Can play as low as 17 lands to make it pretty hard to break off. Can even have a good grind game with up to 4 copies of Deep Analysis. And yeah, so the recent lists have been cutting Augur of Bolas and playing just more cantrips instead. Which I think is pretty good in the meta right now, but it does expose those decks a little bit to Edict effects, and I think that as such, Edict effects are pretty powerful, at least against the Tolarian Terror strategies right now. So let's see. I think those are going to be our S tier decks. Let's see, what do I think comes after that? Honestly, I think there's like a whole entire gap between these decks and the next best decks. I think I put like Kuldotha Burn here, like Boros, Boros decks. We'll just use this to be like all the Boros Skyfisher decks. I think Fog decks end up around here. FAMS is probably like down here. Oh, Affinity's actually probably like right here. Maybe Affinity could even go up in the S tier actually. Affinity is a very strong deck. It does get access to Kenku Artificer now, which is a very powerful card. It's especially strong in the Dimir Delver matchup. And even against Gates, it can be pretty powerful. They do have answers with Journey to Nowhere out of the Gates deck, but if they're not able to journey the 3/3 indestructible flying, it can just do a lot of work. It's able to block guardians, and the Affinity deck just gets a whole lot of value, so it can be immensely powerful and very hard to stop once it gets going. So let's talk about these decks. I think Kuldotha, it was pretty strong in the meta a couple weeks ago, but I think that the matchup against Coggate is really, really hard for that deck. Prismatic Strands does a lot of work. Cat does a lot of work. And then it's just generally very hard because you need to grind, kind of. You can't just go full balls to the wall or you just die to Strands. And then if you're trying to grind, you're just not as good of a grind deck as the Coggate deck is. And then I thought it was pretty decent against the Dimir Terror strategies until I faced Medvedev in the challenge, and he was on 3 copies of main deck Unexpected Fangs. And so I think that with that development, with those decks going with a lot more Unexpected Fangs, and just really going all in on the Turbo 5/5s plan, it does hurt the Kuldotha deck quite a bit. So I think that deck has fallen off a little bit. The meta has adapted around it. So there is also the red-white decks, which I think are decently playable, but they're just not really having, like, there's just not really very much of a reason to actually select those decks. Grix, all these top decks are just getting more value, applying better pressure, faster pressure. Like, this one probably applies the most resilient pressure. This one probably draws the most cards, gets the most value, and this one applies, like, the fastest pressure. So yeah, that's kind of how I would describe the top 3 decks. This one is if you want, like, the most resilient. This one has, like, the highest speed. And then this one has, just, like, the most robustness. So what else is there? There is Turbo Fog is actually, I don't know why I put it there. It's probably down here, really. Blue Delver could be okay. I haven't played against this deck very much. I would probably place it around this tier. Just like the Mono Blue Fairies strategy, it can be okay. It's always going to have the potential to just nut draw you with, you know, turn 1 thing, turn 2 ninja, into protect the ninja, blah, blah, blah. But I think that in general, it is not very strong right now. It's not one of the top decks. It definitely has a hard time versus Affinity, has a hard time versus a Resolved Squadron Hawk, and then it can also have a hard time versus the pressure of multiple 5/5s out of the Delver deck, or out of the Tolarian Terror deck, rather. I'd probably put Bogles around. Bogles might even be able to get into here, just because I think it does have a decent matchup against all 3 of the top decks. Obviously, they're going to have hate cards, especially the white deck, especially the Coggate strategy. They're going to have hate cards, and if they draw the hate cards, you probably lose. But, I mean, Bogles isn't that popular right now, and if they're, like, cutting hate cards or whatever, you could have a pretty good time as the Bogles player. It's probably pretty hard to interact with Bogles as any of these 3 strategies. This one does tend to be playing Chainers, so that can be a little bit difficult for Bogles to deal with, but I think in general, Bogles is actually probably decently well positioned right now. Let's see, the Cascade piles, the Ponza decks. I mean, these are kind of the same thing. Let's put this right here. I think those are probably also B tier. They can have decent matchups against not Soul Sisters, the Coggate decks. Can have decent matchups versus the Tolarian Terror decks as well. I think those decks have been running extremely low land counts, and if they're not on a version that's overloaded with spell pierces, you can, like, if you're able to resolve a couple land destruction spells, you can probably just shut them out of the game, and then your Cascaders can trade off with the big juicers, and you can maybe win the game that way. But I think in general, they're probably having a hard time versus Affinity, and I think even versus the Delver, the Tolarian Terror deck, it's probably something like a 50-50 matchup. It's not, I don't think it's actually like a super favorable matchup or anything. So what else exists? I guess we'll use Jeskai Affinity to talk about the deck that Hysen01 used to get, what did he get, like top 4 in the Super PTQ this past weekend. I think that deck is probably around here. It's probably a little bit of a better version of Red-White. I think I do like the idea of playing like Deadly Disputes in that type of deck, and I think the black removal is pretty well positioned right now. Like Chainer's Edict, like I was saying, is extremely strong against Dimir Delver or Dimir Tolarian Terror, and can be okay versus Affinity, and even gives you outs to Jardian of the Guild Pact. So I think it can be totally fine in the meta right now. And honestly, that is pretty much all the decks I consider real decks, at least from here. Let me double check, see if I'm missing anything. I guess we can rank Kiln Fiend. Kiln Fiend is probably in here. I mean, it's just not particularly good. I think the Dimir Tolarian Terror strategies are pretty good against the Blitz decks. They're kind of incentivized to run Hydros anyway, just to deal with burn, but I mean, they're obviously packing Snuffs, potentially Chainers, which is very hard to interact with from Blitz side. You can't Apostle's Blessing Chainers, and yeah, they're also presenting gnarly fast clocks with the multiple 5/5 openings that can just really exploit Blitz's lack of a defense. And then, so let's talk about Familiars. I think Familiars could be okay. I've been playing a decent bit of it lately, but, I mean, it definitely has a hard matchup versus the Tolarian Terror strategies. It probably does have actually a pretty good matchup against Gates. It might be the best deck against Gates in the format, but you can still definitely drop games and matches to Guardian draws. Like a fast Guardian paired with some Basilisk Gates can be pretty hard to beat. And then I think that the matchup versus Affinity is probably not very good for blue-white familiars. So I would say it probably loses to both of these two decks, but it does have a decent matchup against Soul Sisters. And, you know, I love playing familiars, so I'll probably play it anyway. And then Turbo Fog, I don't know, man. This is probably more like a tier 3 deck. Like, it just seems hard to beat any of these top 3 decks. They're able to have counters for your fogs, and if they're able to counter a fog on a critical turn, or just run you out of cards by countering card draw, you're just having a bad time as a Turbo Fog player, so I don't really know why you would select the deck in this meta. And yeah, I think that's basically all I need to rank here in terms of the tier list. So this is going to be the tier list for this week. Notably, there is a big gap right here. I think that these 3 decks are a lot stronger than all the rest of the decks in the format. So I would consider these the most powerful decks in the format by far. And yeah, thanks for watching. Make sure to click the subscribe button down below, and I'll see you guys next time.